Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. And let me tell you what I'm going to try to do today and next Tuesday, finish it up. I'm going to try to talk about my experiences as a Disney Imagineer, how I got there, what I did when I was there. And as I go through some of the things that I was involved in, I'm going to talk about the Disney company and what was going on in the background politically and business wise as all these things were going on, and also what was going on in my life. So it's going to be a kind of a personal view of my experience. I can't really speak to other Imagineers and other people, but I'll try to include as much as I can. And I want you guys to feel free to jump in, interrupt me, tell your own, make your own comments or questions. Don't make this a lecture. I want it to be a conversation. So I'm going to start kind of where it all started for me to kind of chart the path of how I ended up at Imagineering. And it really goes back to Pomona College and my senior year. So I'm going to start there and then move forward chronologically. So my senior year at Pomona, a few seminal things happened. In fall of my senior year, I fell in love with Paula Richardson, who I married and who married me in June of
That works
1969.
out.
And Paula was a year behind me. She was in the class of 1970. Some of you may have known her. We paired up in the fall of my senior year, and that was a very tumultuous year because I was dealing with the draft. I was 1A, and my draft board had made it clear that they didn't consider me a conscientious objector. I was against the Vietnam War, and I was determined to stay out of the draft. So I was looking for a way to do that. And I had also kind of changed my whole trajectory in terms of my career path. When I started at Pomona, I thought that I was going to be a lawyer. I thought I was going to go to law school, so I majored in economics, thinking that would prepare me for law school. And then the '60s happened, and in my junior and senior year, I moved. It was clear to me I wasn't going to go to law school. I became very involved in the counterculture and started hanging out with reprobate people like Tony Johnson and Fred Feller and Doug Dennis and others, and got all involved in drugs and music and rock and roll and political protesting and all that stuff. So I knew I wasn't going to law school, but I was looking for a way out of the draft. And
Barry, I want to
so
make a comment. Those were not inconsistent with going to law school.
thank you, Chuck. I
They're sort of
appreciate that.
required.
I appreciate that. Anyway, I discovered that I could get a year and a half deferment from the draft if I got a teaching credential. So I decided, well, by the way, Paula and I had decided we were going to be partners for life, and that turned out to be true in her case anyway. And I ended up enrolling in the teacher credential program at San Francisco State. And I chose elementary education because believed that by high school, kids were pretty well formed and thought I would have a better chance of really making an impact on them as an elementary school teacher. So we moved to San Francisco. I enrolled at San Francisco State in a credential program, and Paula supported us by sewing leather in a leather shop on Castro Street called the East West Musical Instrument Company, and which was right down the street from Harvey Milk's photography store. And at that time, when I got into the education department at San Francisco State, a lot of exciting things were happening with elementary education. This was the era of Summerhill and individualized education and books like How Children Learn and How Children Fail by John Holt. And all the emphasis was on sort of moving away from traditional teacher in the front of the classroom, passively listening, into learning centers and individualized instruction. So I got very excited about that and was actually really eager to start teaching. And during that time, the draft lottery came up, and for the first time in my life, I actually won a drawing. I drew number 365. So I was literally going to be the last person drafted. And so now didn't have that one worry, but I was really invested in teaching and eager to look for a teaching job. I had done my student teaching in Marin County, and I was looking for a teaching job in Marin County in the early '70s. And so was everybody else who came out of the credential program. And there were very few teaching jobs available. So for 1 year, I managed to subsist and support us by doing a half-time teaching job in Novato and another half-time teaching job in Mill Valley. Meanwhile, Paula was continuing her education at Berkeley and completing her bachelor's degree. And Paula and I were living next door to Doug Dennis and Julie Dennis in San Rafael. And Doug was working for Mayflower Moving Company at that time, as I recall, and we were playing a lot of tennis. So it was a good time, actually. But I finally got a teaching job in Ukiah, which wasn't in Marin County, but was in southern Mendocino County, and was a small town that was very conservative. It's basically the two main industries in Ukiah were pear orchards and masonite. They were the biggest employers. And
And marijuana.
well, that was, yeah, and marijuana, yeah. And also, Chuck's right, there were also a lot of counterculture people coming into Mendocino County from Berkeley and Stanford, starting preschools and free schools and other things. So it was an exciting time to be there. But I probably would have never been hired as a teacher there because my hair was long and my educational philosophies were pretty radical at the time. The only reason I was able to be hired was that they had a sudden opening in September after the school year started, where a sixth grade teacher resigned, and it was a Title VII classroom. So in order to hire anybody to replace him, had to have the approval of the principal, the superintendent, and the director of the Title VII program, who was a master's graduate from the University of Chicago named Vicki Kaplan. So Vicki really liked me and wanted to hire me, and so she basically held out because it's the principal and the vice and the superintendent had no interest in hiring me at all. And she basically said, "Look, if you want to have a teacher in place, you better hire him." So they did. So I started teaching in a public sixth grade classroom in the fall of 1971, I think that would have been, and. And I was determined not to do traditional teaching. So I wanted to throw out the textbooks. I wanted to not use grades. I didn't want students sitting in their seats all through the day and doing workbook pages. So I was developing alternative curriculum and putting into practice all the things I had read about and had studied at San Francisco State, much to the chagrin of my principal, who thought the class was completely out of control. And but the students were having a great time, and I actually because I had half of the class were Native Americans who had come from different parts of the area, and most of them were performing reading well below sixth grade level. And also a lot of the higher achieving students wanted out of my class and into the more traditional class across the hall. So I had a fairly low achieving group of students, most of whom were reading at between a third and a fourth grade level. So it was actually a good situation for me to try out my rather non-traditional ideas about education. And I'll just give you one quick anecdote from that time because I want to get us to Disney. But I had read that it was a good idea to let students control the environment of the classroom
Ah,
and change it in ways that they sound good to them. So I invited the kids to bring refrigerator boxes or anything they wanted from home and to build a kind of their own version of the classroom inside the real classroom. And they took me up on this offer. And within a couple of days, the classroom had become a maze of these cardboard cubicles that they had designed, all suspended from the lights in the classroom, and got to the point where I had to tunnel through these things to find students. And I remember one day hadn't seen, they were working away on their individual assignments and actually doing pretty well. So one day I was looking for one of these students and couldn't find him. His name was Sam Smith. And I asked the other students where he was, and they said, "Well, he's in his box, Mr. B. You'll have to go find him." So I tunneled in, and there he was in his box. He had rigged up a heating plate, a hot plate. He was heating up some soup for himself and working on his math work, and very diligently. And I was really glad to find him. Anyway, at the end of that year, the principal called me in and said, "Well, I assume you don't want to come back for a second year." I said, well, what makes you think that? And he said, well, your class was completely out of control. I said, well, that was by design. I didn't want them to be controlled. I wanted them to be individualized and working on things. And by the way, my class did as well on the standard tests as the class across the hall that never left their seats all through class time. So he said, well, I don't want you in this school. So if we can find another school in the district, good luck. Unfortunately, I did. I found another school in the district with a principal who was very open to my approach to education. And I ended up teaching 3 more years of sixth grade there. And during that time, Paula decided she was going to get a teaching credential because she had completed her BA. And she was commuting to Sonoma State in Rohnert Park, got a teaching credential, and taught for 1 year and hated it. It was hated teaching. She taught first grade, and it was completely not suitable to her temperament. She was a very quiet, shy, introverted person and hated the whole idea of being on stage and performing and, motivating all these crazy students. So meanwhile, she decided she wanted to become an architect because she was a very talented builder and designer. And she had met some design builders in Mendocino County and saw the potential to apprentice with one of those. But she was also still in communication with Doug Dennis, who by this time was a student at UCLA in the Masters of Architecture program. And he was really excited about that program and was really trying to motivate Paula to think about coming back to LA and pursue a more academic approach to architecture. So we finally decided to take Doug up on his urging, move back to Los Angeles. Paula actually enrolled in SciArc for, I think, 1 or 2 years to prepare for getting into the master's program at UCLA. And I think Julie Dennis was working as the head librarian at SciArc at that time, right, Doug? I think so.
Yeah, she was the number two in charge.
Yep. All right. So we moved back to LA. We ended up, Doug helped us get a rental house on Federal Avenue, right behind where he and Julie were living, a small little cottage that we rented. And I taught another year. I taught a year of special ed in a private school in Calabasas. And I'm sorry. Somebody want to say something? Okay. Anyway, so I taught for a year, and then I decided I really wanted to get out of classroom teaching and get into curriculum development, because in my years of teaching, I had developed a lot of curriculum because I wasn't using the standard textbooks. And I was, in fact, during one trip that Paul and I took to England during that time, I spent a day in Foyle's bookstore just buying all the educational materials because the British primary schools were way ahead of the American schools in innovative approaches to elementary education. So I'd already developed a lot of curriculum on my own, and that was really what I wanted to do. But I was having a hard time finding jobs doing that. I did about a year of freelance writing of educational materials, but it wasn't working out well. And so I was desperate for some way to get into that field. And my mom suggested that I call a friend of the family's named Marty Sklar, who was working at Walt Disney Company at the time. Well, I didn't know anything about what he was doing there, but he'd been a family friend. So I set up a meeting with him and went to meet with him in the summer of 1977. And he said, well, what can I do for you? And I said, well, I was hoping you would introduce me to some of the people at the Walt Disney Educational Media Company who might hire me to develop curriculum. Now, I was not very hopeful of this happening because at that time, the curriculum, the educational materials Disney was producing were not leading edge or progressive at all, and were not anything like what I was interested in doing. But I thought I would do my mom a favor and meet with Marty anyway. So Marty said, look, I'll be happy to introduce you to people at the Educational Media Company, but are you interested in what we're doing here at WED Enterprises? And WED Enterprises was the company that now is called Walt Disney Imagineering, but that was set up by Walt to design and build Disneyland. And he purposely set it up separate from the studio so he could avoid the labor unions that he would have had to deal with had he kept employed the people that he was using for the film business. So I said, well, what do you do here at WED? I knew nothing about it. He said, well, this is where we design the theme parks. And I said, well, I'm really interested in education, so really not interested in theme parks. He said, well, let me tell you about a theme park we're designing right now called Epcot. And he tells me about Epcot. and that it's an educational theme park, and it's going to have pavilions about communication and the oceans and transportation and energy. And I said, well, that sounds kind of interesting. So he said, well, how about if we do this? How about if we bring you into WED Enterprises on a 3-month consulting contract? You see if you like what we're doing. I'll put you in the research and planning department so you can kind of figure out what's going on in the company. And you see if you're interested in us, and we'll see if we're interested in you. So I said, okay. So I started in the research and planning department in 1977 and ended up spending the next 27 years working for Disney Imagineering. Because when I got into the place, I was intrigued with the amazing talent that was there. I mean, if you think about, and I had never thought about the fact that there was a place where all this stuff at Disneyland was designed. I love Disneyland, but I didn't really think about where that stuff came from. But once I got in there, I saw that this was an amazing collection of talented people, ranging from artists and writers, ride designers, architects, interior designers, lighting designers, computer programmers, audiovisual producers, special effects people. I mean, an amazing array of talent. And I thought, boy, this is really fun. And plus, I loved being in the research and planning department because I kept getting these really interesting assignments from people and calls for me to do work. So I got to meet all the people and understand how Imagineering really worked. And I'll give you an example of some of the assignments I got. I got a call one day that said, well, we're working on a concept for a travel agency of the future for Epcot. So could you research the travel industry and write a scenario of what a travel agency of the future might be like? And I thought that was a great assignment because I loved finding out about new things. And I was really eager to prove my mettle as a creative person. So I really put a lot of energy into the scenarios I wrote and so forth. And then I would get some business assignments, to look into certain companies that they were looking for as Epcot sponsors, and really enjoyed the work. But I want to talk a little bit about what the status of the company was at that time and what Epcot was at that time. Because when I joined in 1977, Epcot was well underway in design, but hadn't yet been greenlit by corporate as a go project, because it needed to have one more pavilion sponsored in order to pencil out and to be greenlit. So at the time, the Disney company was in a situation that I would describe as the doldrums. It was the post-Walt Disney era. The CEO of the company was a guy named Card Walker, who had been a marketing guy under Walt's direction. It was not really a creative guy at all. The movie studio, the live action movie studio, was run by Ron Miller, who was Walt's son-in-law, who'd been a football player at SC and was not a really stellar creative mind either. And the live action movie business was really in the doldrums. In fact, a good example of that was that at that period, the big Disney had a reputation at that point, the Disney Studios being the premier special effects house in Hollywood, because of the movies that they had done, the Herbie movies and the Flubber movies and all these special effects movies. But at that point, it was just about the time that George Lucas was producing Star Wars. And when Star Wars came out, Disney's response to that was the black hole. And that kind of tells the story of where Disney was in film development versus the rest of the industry. And as far as the live action films, there were all these novelty films, family films, Flubber, The Absent-Minded Professor. They were those kind of films. There was no real serious live action movies being produced by Disney. Even the animation at that time, which had been the stellar part of the Disney film product, was really not in a great place. Their big hit movie at that time, or they hoped it would be a hit, was The Fox and the Hounds, which was not up to the quality of the classic Disney films like Snow White and Sleeping Beauty and Peter Pan and so on. So the company was not in a great place. There were only 2 theme parks in existence, Disneyland in California and the Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World. And they had purchased 27,000 acres of land in Florida and had really not done much to develop it other than build Magic Kingdom and 2 hotels. The Contemporary Hotel, which was the novelty of the Contemporary Hotel, was that the monorail passed right through the center of the atrium of the hotel. And the hotel itself was constructed in a modular way where the rooms were built manufactured, built off site, and then inserted into the armature of the hotel. And then the other hotel that Disney had built was the Polynesian. But they really didn't want to be in the hotel business at that point, so they had leased out land property in Walt Disney World for companies like Travelodge and Howard Johnson's to build hotels and operate them. So they really just were not innovating in any respect, and the company was not in a great place financially, and they were desperate to do something in another park in Florida because they wanted to balance out the seasonality, because the Magic Kingdom, which was a larger version of Disneyland, was very popular, but it was mainly busy in the summer and vacations when families could actually get there and get their kids out of school. And it kind of died off in the winter term. So they wanted another gate, another park in Florida that could balance out seasonality. And there were no really exciting ideas in the hopper. So everything was, well, what would Walt have done? So they looked back to what Walt's last idea was. And his last idea before he passed away that he'd been working on was a concept called Epcot Center, or Epcot, which stood for Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. And Walt's concept of Epcot was that it would be an actual working city, that people would live there, and it would be an opportunity for corporations and research laboratories to bring their latest technologies to the party, so that there would be a chance to experiment and live in futuristic ways, but it would be a living community with schools and businesses and as well as homes. Well, the company looked at that concept and said, well, we can't do that. We can't build a city. That's not going to work. And so the Imagineers had decided that maybe they could take Walt's idea and kind of tweak it in a direction and make it more like a permanent World's Fair, so that there would be pavilions like you found in a World's Fair about serious subjects like energy and transportation and communication. And then there would be a kind of an international showcase. They called it World Showcase, of pavilions about countries. So would have that multicultural aspect and the technology aspect, but would essentially be a theme park that was kind of like a permanent World's Fair. And that's what the company was involved in designing when I showed up in 1977. So there were a lot of challenges associated with that. And the main challenge was, well, how would Disney use its skills in entertainment, in creating rides and films and theater shows, and apply them to serious subjects like energy, communications, the oceans, and so on. And it wasn't clear how that would really work. So each pavilion, which was under design already and had a sponsor signed up, took a different approach. The signature pavilion was this called Spaceship Earth, and it's the signature piece of architecture for Epcot. It looks like a geodesic dome, but it's not a dome. It's not a geodesic dome. It just is built to resemble one. It was sponsored by AT&T, and the story was the history of communication from writing on cave walls to the computer. And the ride system was a kind of an omnimover system, a simple ride system that it went through these scenes of milestones in communication history. And so that was one approach. The Energy Pavilion, which was sponsored by Exxon, was going to tell the story of energy. But of course, we had some problems with Exxon's view of the future of energy. They didn't want to admit that fossil fuels were a finite resource and that we were going to be running out of them and that we needed to look beyond fossil fuels. They thought that they didn't want to talk about that. And that points up an issue that affected all of the pavilions in Future World, which is they had these major corporate sponsors that had messages they wanted to convey. And then we had the Disney approach to storytelling, which was entertainment and fun and upbeat messaging. And then you had the academic community, because each of the pavilions had an academic advisory board that tried to keep Disney honest and keep the sponsors from getting overly parochial in their messaging by telling us what the real facts of these subjects were. And that made for an interesting dynamic. And I actually had interactions during my career with a number of these advisory boards, and actually chaired some of the advisory board meetings, and I'll tell you more about as we get further into the story. But meanwhile, back to my work as well, let me just say this. Disney's conclusion about how they would navigate this tension between the sponsor, the advisory board, and Disney was that we would not be the content experts. Disney would be the storytellers. We would be the communicators, and we would communicate messages that were validated by the advisory boards and hopefully accessible to the sponsors. And that our role would be to not to provide a whole deep encyclopedia of information about these subjects, but to present turn-ons, inspirational, exciting presentations that would inspire guests to learn more on their own after they left the park. So that was the role we had. So back to what I was doing on. So let me just run down the pavilions that were sponsored at that time. The Spaceship Earth was sponsored by AT&T. Universe of Energy was sponsored by Exxon. General Electric sponsored a pavilion called Horizons, which was kind of an outgrowth of the GE-sponsored Carousel of Progress show that meant its intention was to showcase ways of living in the future. And it was a ride that took you to a futuristic farming thing on the moon and an undersea mining operation and some other different possibilities for the future, and then kind of let you choose the future you wanted at the end. And then the Living Seas Pavilion, which was not under design yet, but that was starting to be thought about. And then let's see, and the Land Pavilion, which was sponsored by Kraft, and that one we actually worked with a member of the advisory board named Carl Hodges, who was a pioneer in growing plants in artificial environments. And so we had a boat ride through a hydroponic environment where plants were grown outside of the soil and in different ways. And it was a working hydroponic experiment. So it actually was probably, of all the pavilions, was the most consistent with the mission of Epcot, which was to showcase future possibilities for how we could live on Spaceship Earth. And by the way, we chose the name Spaceship Earth for the communications pavilion because of the Buckminster Fuller idea that we are passengers on this Spaceship Earth, passengers, and we have a responsibility to how to guide this Spaceship Earth forward. In fact, I got to meet Bucky Fuller. He actually showed up to review our ideas for the park and actually liked what we were doing, and it was a fun experience to actually meet him. So those were the pavilions, but again, the project hadn't been greenlit. We needed one more sponsor, and I'll tell you in a minute how that came about. But some of the assignments I got, I told you about the travel agency of the future. I also was asked to develop an idea for the post-show area for the AT&T Communications Pavilion. And I came up with this idea called the Epcot Forum that would be a computer-assisted way of accessing information about subjects of interest. And I wrote a script for a forum of the future of the American family that could be presented in a kind of a projection, surround projection capsule with, a lot of the things that we take for granted today with the internet. Marty Sklar, who was always my boss and mentor for the time that I worked at Imagineering, kept throwing me into different design groups to add content input to what they were doing. And this was not always a welcome experience for me, because I'll give you an example. There was a group working on a concept for an invention and enterprise pavilion. And Marty felt like they needed some input from someone who knew something about economics. And so since I had a degree in econ, he threw me into this group, uninvited. And the group was headed by Rolly Crump, who was a classic, legendary Disney designer. He had designed the Small World clock and the Tower of the Small and the Small World dolls for that attraction, and was noted for his whimsical approach to design and he had a small group of people working on just fun ideas about invention and enterprise. The main thing they had come up with was a comic book called The Parasols of Progress about cavemen inventing the umbrella. And anyway, so he threw me into that group, and you can imagine how unwelcome a guy with a BA in economics was to a group that was trying to design fun things about business and enterprise. But I ended up hitting it off with them, and ended up meeting some interesting people that I worked with later on other projects. The project didn't go anywhere. But one of my assignments, which was one of the things that my immediate boss at Research and Planning, Frank Stanek, said was, I don't want you guys sitting in your offices all day. I want you out in the organization, meeting the different disciplines, learning what they do, figuring out how you can add value to their work. And if I don't get a couple of calls every week about how you guys are nosing into their business, you're not doing your jobs right. So I took him at his word and really spent a lot of time just getting to know the people and the disciplines that made up Imagineering. And I was given an assignment that was actually not a very creative assignment, I thought, but it turned out to be my key to getting into the creative division, which was to writing scope documents. The scope documents were attempts to capture the state of the design on a given project at a point in time. And you would go around and you would talk with the ride designers and the show designers and the film people and everybody that was working on the project, and try to summarize scene by scene what we knew about the design at that point in time. How many projectors were there? How many animatronic figures? How many lighting instruments? All the stuff that you might want to know about. And it was kind of a boring process, but it did force me to get to know a lot of different people. And each page of this thing had one paragraph at the top was, what is the story point of this particular scene? And most of the scope writers didn't pay much attention to that. They focused on the projector counts and the lighting counts and everything else. But I spent a lot of time laboring over that one paragraph because I really wanted to make it say what that scene was about. And that turned out to be a very important thing, because one of the young designers at the time, Tony Baxter, who turned out to be a Disney legend, but he had designed his first project when he got there was Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, a project that he had thought about before he even was hired there, and they ended up building it. And so he was the young up-and-coming designer at the time, and he had been asked to form a team. He had been working on a land pavilion concept that didn't go anywhere, but I had written a scope for that project, and he liked my little paragraphs. And so he called me one day and he said, I really like what you wrote on your scope documents for the land. How would you like to join the team I'm setting up to develop a imagination pavilion for Kodak? I said, great, I'd love to. So I got transferred over to the creative division and was working with Tony and a small team to develop a concept for Kodak, which would have, had it not been approved, probably Epcot would have never happened, because it was the key project to greenlight the entire Epcot project. So we set to work on an imagination pavilion. Tony was really interested in the ride. He had a concept for a ride called Journey into Imagination, which starred two characters, the Dreamfinder and Figment of Imagination, a little purple dragon that was the mascot of that. And he also wanted to do a 3D film, which became Magic Journeys. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But they also wanted to do a hands-on interactive art and technology playground as a third element. And so I raised my hand and said, I'll take that one, because it was really fit in with my background in education and my interests at the time. And so Tony said, you got it, run with it. So I ended up becoming a show producer, which didn't exist. I was the first person that did that at Imagineering. And what that involved was sort of managing a design team. And being a bridge between the design group and the project management and the construction team and so forth. So I had no background in this. I'd never done anything like it before other than managing a group of sixth graders. And I was suddenly in charge of a project for a 10,000 square foot art and technology playground that had to open. I started working on it in about 1979. It had to open by October 1982. So it was a pretty tight schedule, but I was really excited about it and happy to do it and put a team together. I had designers, industrial designers working with me, an artist named Rennie Rao, who was in charge of the look of it. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, I don't know when to interject this question because
Anytime.
It was something you said about Epcot that I wanted to follow up with. And I'm interested in the tension between the commercial interests, the entertainment interests, and the other pieces there, because I see this now in museums in Southern California. We were at the Peterson Automotive Museum recently, and the main exhibit on the top floor there is sponsored by Waymo, and it's an exhibit about self-driving autonomous vehicles. And other museums and art museums I've seen recently exhibits by commercial enterprises or Ralph Lauren design firms. So I'm curious about how those battles were fought, or if you have any insight into this pressure between the entertainment side, the ticket selling side, and the commercial side when in the building of Epcot.
Well, it was an omnipresent issue in the building of Epcot and the design of Epcot, and it differed sponsor to sponsor. The interactions with each sponsor were a little bit different because of their particular cultures and the messages they wanted to get across and what we wanted to accomplish. So there were cases where the companies deferred to us entirely. For example, General Motors in the World of Motion Pavilion, we came up with a very whimsical Disney-esque ride through the history of transportation that they were perfectly happy with. They wanted to show their automobiles in the post-show area, and we said no. We're not going to do any project showcasing in the post-show area, and they accepted that. And they actually went outside to an outside designer named Bob Rogers, who designed some post-show elements for them, which included a bird and robot show about robotics and a water engine show about the development of alternative engine technologies. So they were pretty easy. Kodak was really easy because the subject was imagination and they had no expertise in it, so they completely deferred to us on it. Exxon was very difficult. They really didn't want to talk about oil, petroleum as a finite resource. We wanted to put solar collectors on the outside of the pavilion. They didn't want to do that. So it was a constant battle with them. They did finally agree to a primeval diorama of dinosaurs that alluded to the formation of fossil fuels. So we sort of won some and lost some in that one. The pre-show, we actually was really pretty cool. We used we brought in a designer who had worked on World's Fairs, and a European, I forget his name, designed this multi-screen pre-show that was really interesting and felt really pretty good. But the main part of the show, the one thing we did develop for them was a theater vehicle a theater-sized vehicle. So the guests would enter and sit in these theater seats, and then after an initial presentation, the audience seats would move, the theater sections would move through the primeval diorama, through the thing, and we used to refer to it as riding on sunshine. But that was kind of the innovation. So that one didn't go too well. The GE Pavilion, Horizons, they were pretty good with, because it was kind of about lifestyles and things, even though it didn't really talk about their projects. They were fine with it, but they didn't re-up for a second decade of sponsorship because it didn't really accomplish their business aims. AT&T was happy with Spaceship Earth because they had the signature show of the whole project, but it didn't talk about their products particularly. But in the post-show area, we did some things around telephonic communications that they were happy with. So each one was different, and but it was always a constant tension. I'll share one thing. We were trying to, in a way, Disney itself was coming to grips with content-based entertainment. We'd never done this before, really. I mean, Walt Disney had a few shows at Disneyland that alluded to content-based. There was the Voyage Through Inner Space that was sponsored by Monsanto, and he had done sponsored shows before at World's Fairs. The Small World was originally a World's Fair show, and the GE Carousel of Progress was originally done at World's Fair. So he had some experience in that. But Epcot was really a new level of sponsorship and sponsor involvement. And speaking about museums, one of the things, as I was one of the few education people that got hired at Imagineering. And so I was kind of, whenever Disney was approached by museums or educational groups to work with them, I was always given the job of doing it, which was great for me because I ended up working on a number of museum projects while I was an Imagineer, including the Baltimore Children's Museum, which was designed by Imagineers, a group that I was part of, and the Skirball Cultural Center, where we helped them design their original exhibits as well. So and that helped me because when I retired from Disney, I did consulting work for a number of museums, and museums had a love-hate relationship with Disney and still do. They coveted the audience of Disney. They didn't really trust Disney as a purveyor of factual information. They were sort of felt like Disney always, made everything fun and games and didn't really deal with content very well. So Epcot was really a chance for us to get our feet wet in that arena. So anyway, I'm busy. I'm starting now to work on imagination, and I have a team to develop what we ended up calling the Imageworks, and 3 years to do it. And it was an interesting project because the ride was telling the story of how the imagination creative process works. And the idea they came up with was a 3-part process that you gather inputs from your senses to the world you live in. You store them in your brain and you recombine them to other things that become new ideas. And the Dream Finder was the sort of the purveyor of this idea in the ride. And Figment was kind of the childlike, character who's just interested in everything and excited about everything. And the two of them take you through this learning process of how creative ideas are developed, and through different realms of art and science and literature. And the idea was that the Imageworks would be a place for guests to actually experience this. They would be able to use new technologies to create new things in a very playground-like environment. That's what I was trying to design. Now, the problems and the challenges of that were that this exhibit area, Imageworks, existed at the exit for the ride, and the ride was processing about 2,000 people an hour. And if anybody who's familiar, Bob knows this, all the Disney parks are obsessed with throughput, capacity. That's the whole thing of processing people in an efficient way and moving them from experience to experience. So when you have 2,000 people an hour coming off a ride into an exhibit area that can only accommodate maybe a third or a quarter of those people, and not for very long, because you can't really hold attention spans of people in a theme park for a long time with an exhibit where they have to learn a lot to do it. So we had to design things that could be instantaneously grasped by the guests and accomplished quickly and were sort of immediately gratifying to them. And so we had to come up with these really, I thought, challenging ideas that were easy to learn and quick to reward the guest's attention span. So I'll tell you a little about some of the things we came up with. One of the easiest ones to accomplish technically and most popular was called stepping tones. And and by the way, our goal was to hit as many of the creative art forms as we could, and always showcase technology and always make it interactive. So stepping tones was a musical instrument that you could walk on. That was the idea. So it was an area that guests passed through. And what we did was we put floor switches under the carpet, so the guests were triggering sounds, and we projected light patterns of like a hexagonal beehive pattern on the floor. And then we engaged a composer to compose electronic notes that would sound good no matter how many people were jumping around on these things, because as they jumped around, they would trigger sounds. And if there were 20 people in the room, it could be cacophonous, but again, the sounds were designed so it always kind of sounded harmonic. And it was really fun. Guests really enjoyed it. And biggest challenge we had was during installation, getting the installers to stop playing with it and to finish their work. They had a lot of fun with it. Another idea we came up with, we wanted to somehow get guests involved in acting in a movie. So we came up with this idea, probably the most technologically innovative thing we did. It was called the Dreamfinder School of Drama. And we were using blue screen technology, which had only been used in major film productions, but we were using it in a audience participation manner to mat the guests into movies and short little movies. And so we figured out a way so that they could stand up in a line, 5 or 6 guests at a time, and they would be directed by the Dreamfinder on a monitor and into a scene. And that we would make these little films that had a hole in them for the guests to be batted in, and then we would instruct them to do various things that fit with a storyline. For example, one of the stories was a Western, and at one point in time they were chasing a bad guy across the top of a train car. So we had them turn together and run in place, and they could see the finished product as they were doing this. They could see that they were running along a train car, or they would engage in a tug of war or a shootout with the bad guy. So they were having an acting experience and seeing the finished product, and all this was happening in real time. And then they could buy a copy of the video that they were in at the end. So that was quite a task to pull that off and do that all in real time. We also had go ahead, Leslie.
So we were talking recently about patenting things like that. And when I took my kids to Universal Studios, they totally stole that. And they used it for E.T. You were riding the bike and all of that. So how does that work when another competing theme park totally steals your technology and your idea?
Happens all the time. I can't tell you how many ripoffs of Stepping Tones there were all over the place. Everybody did them. And we couldn't really patent anything in that particular context because blue screen technology already existed. It had its own patents. We were taking advantage of those, and we were not able to patent protect very much of anything. Maybe the names of some things, but in that business, imitation is probably the best form of flattery because it happens all the time. I don't know if you have anything to say, Neil, on that one. Okay. All right. So anyway, we did it. We did it. We wanted to do a drawing experience, but we didn't want people to have to figure out how to do a computer drawing thing. So we went to the company that invented the telestrator, which is the technology that's used by sportscasters to draw things. And it's a video drawing technology where the video pen that you use is actually an antenna that's reconfiguring video signals. We got them to develop this system, and we worked closely with them. So it basically, guests would come up to a screen, and there would be a paintbrush, a giant paintbrush that they could use, and they could load it up with different electronic inks and different ways of drawing. They could draw directly on the screen. And now it would be old hat because we can do so much more on our computers. But in those days, that was really a big deal to be able to have an immediate drawing that was very vibrant and fun. Another one we came up with was a concept called the electronic philharmonic. And this was an idea of letting guests play the role of orchestra conductor. We put them in a soundproof booth. There were several booths together, and they were looking out over a group of a group of instruments that we had designed with projected notes coming out. And there were these light beams coming down on the podium in front of them, and they could put their hand in the light beams, and they could control the volume of the different orchestra groups, the strings, the woodwinds, percussion, and they could control the tempo by how fast they conducted. And we had no written instructions. They just looked at other people doing it and figured it out. And it was hilarious to watch all these different conductors, all in their own little personal music experience, conducting away at the Electronic Philharmonic. We also had I was getting ideas from wherever I could steal them and borrow them. And one of them was, I as a teacher, I had always brought my kids on field trips to the Exploratorium, San Francisco, which was a fantastic interactive science museum. And one thing I remembered from the Exploratorium were these pin tables, these giant pin tables were like a pin screen where you put your hands underneath this grid of pins and create light reflections above. So we found the inventor of those things, a guy named Ward Fleming, and contracted with him to build giant pin tables, which we then lit and set up. So we had giant kaleidoscopes and anything we could get our hands on that guests could get involved in. So that was the ImageWorks. We got it built on time and on budget. It was very well received, and interestingly enough, the ride did not make it to opening day. It was still in development, and so the pavilion opened with the ride, with no ride, but just the ImageWorks and the 3D film. And I'll tell you quickly about the 3D film. Tony Baxter, the lead designer for the project for Imagination, had seen a 3D film at Marineland that was directed by a guy named Murray Lerner, who later went on to win an Oscar for a documentary called From Mao to Mozart, Isaac Stern in China. And at that time, 3D film was a real novelty experience. Nobody liked the glasses and all the cumbersomeness of that. And it was not anything that people took seriously as a film medium. But Tony saw in this Sea Dreams film the potential to do something really special that would really capture the wonder of the imaginative process. So we brought Murray in, and he created a film called The Magic Journeys. And we brought in the Sherman Brothers, who had done the music for Mary Poppins, to develop the musical score. And he created a really wonderful 3D film that audiences love. So we opened with just the 3D film and ImageWorks and got great reviews. And also we came up with an idea for the gardens outside the Imagination pavilions called the Leapfrog Fountains. And this was developed by a hydrology expert from our special effects group named Mark Fuller, who later went on to form a company called Wet Design, which did the Bellagio fountains in Las Vegas and a number of fountains all over the world, including in the Middle East. But he came up with this idea of using laminar flow fountains, leapfrogging from one planet to another to music in this really magical way that guests just love. They love trying to get their hands on the water, and the laminar flow was just looked like these beautiful tubes of water. And the thing had they were like characters, the way they were choreographed to music. So it was one of these just hidden gems that came out of the Epcot's project. So anyway, ImageWorks opened, Pavilion opened, everybody was happy, and I was firmly ensconced as a show producer at Imagineering. And after that project opened, and I will say a couple things about Epcot opening. Epcot opened in October of 1982. It was pretty amazing because in the first few months after it opened, they brought world-class entertainment performers from all over to the project. There would be a dance troupe from Africa. There would be, chorus, children's chorus from Switzerland, and people from all over the world. And it really felt like a truly international showcase. Of course, over time, the operators were forced to cut budget and eliminated a lot of those performers. But in those first months after Epcot opened, it was great fun to be a part of it. But of course, the project went way over budget. It was way bigger than anybody assumed, and Imagineering had to grow enormously to get it done. And meanwhile, we were doing across the street from the Epcot design group was a group designing Tokyo Disneyland, which was again a spin-off from the original Disneyland. So it was pretty easy compared to Epcot, but it was a pretty big project in its own right. So after the Epcot opened, the project was not in good financial, the company was not in good financial shape. And, but the project did succeed in changing the seasonality attendance numbers, and we began to get visitors coming all year round and accomplished its goal. But it left the company in some pretty serious financial situations. I will say my next assignment, I'm getting close to getting to an hour here, but my next assignment after that was to move on to the Living Seas team, which was busy in designing their pavilion, which was due to open in '85. And they had in that pavilion, the showcase was a saltwater aquarium. And the storyline was that you came into the pavilion and saw a movie. And after the movie, which introduced you to the sort of the potential for the oceans in our future, you got into these elevators that were special effects experience called hydrolators that simulated a subsea descent. So we made the guests feel like they were going under the sea. And when the doors opened to your hydrolator, what you saw directly into this huge saltwater aquarium with all kinds of marine life swimming around. And the lighting was such that you found yourself in what was an undersea research laboratory that we called Seabase Alpha, which had a bunch of exhibits about oceanography and future technologies in the sea. So that project was under a lot of schedule pressure to get those exhibits designed, and so I helped get them ready for production as my next assignment. And when I had completed that, I started a team on a R&D assignment that we called the Tron Arcade, which is inspired by the movie Tron, which had just come out, and the dawn of the video game business, which was becoming very big. And plus the company, because of the ImageWorks, the company was interested now in interactive experiences, because we figured out that if we could make enough of them and put them and make them easy enough to learn, we could get enough throughput so that they could be an element in Epcot and maybe a business of their own, which it turned out to be. Actually, we ended up opening a Disney designed game arcade called Disney Quest. There were two of those in years to come. But at that point, we're just about at an hour. So I will open the floor to any questions or comments, but I will go on next time and talk about the Tron Arcade project and its ultimate downfall. And then my next big project for Epcot which was Wonders of Life. So based on the pacing of this one, this may actually, Tony, be a three segment presentation rather than two, because I want to leave time for California Adventure. But any comments or questions? Or Bob, as a former ride operator, anything you have to add? Mr. Philby,
What? What did you ask?
anything you have to add as a former Disney ride operator?
I have nothing good to say, really. It was a neat place to leave work. The best times I had in Disney were getting off
75
the
online.
job when all the people left, all the customers left, and it was just staff that was walking down the streets. That was a very nice time.
Hey, well, as one closing thing, I did want to talk about this and I left it out. I wanted to talk a little about the layout of Disneyland. So let me just do that real quickly and get that out of the way. One of the things that, I mean, Walt Disney is, I think, reasonably acknowledged as being a pioneer in several areas of feature animation films and also cross marketing from television to film to theme parks. But the layout of Disneyland, the hub and spokes design of that park, is also a real achievement of Disney's. And I think I want to just describe how it works. The whole idea of Disneyland's layout was to take you from the outside world into a world of imagination and possibilities and creativity through a process that we refer to as, what do we call it? Suspension of disbelief. And the way it worked was you parked your car in the parking lot and you immediately boarded a tram. So you were ridden up to the ticket booths. So that was your first ride of the experience. Then you got through the ticketing process and the turnstiles, and you went through two tunnels. So there was a transition from the outside world of commerce into this other world. You emerged into the town square of Main Street, which was a nostalgic rendition of Walt's hometown of Marceline, Missouri. And it had real businesses and fake businesses along a street, and no real shows other than Meet Mr. Lincoln, which was on this. And this was a place to get some food and whatever. And at the end of Main Street was the castle, Sleeping Beauty's castle, which was the visual weenie that was drawing you through Main Street toward the castle. And then when you got through Main Street, you found yourself in the hub, and there were gateways to all of the lands: Adventureland, Frontierland, Tomorrowland, Fantasyland. And when you went through those gateways, you then were into those storylines of the jungle if it was Adventureland, or the future, or rocket jets if it was Tomorrowland, or if it was Fantasyland, you encountered all those classic Disney dark rides, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, and Peter Pan, and Dumbo, There was a carousel in the center. So as you moved through the experience, you got deeper into the storylines of each of these places, and so that you were able to experience, like when you went through in Adventureland, you kind of were in the jungle, and you saw the Swiss Family Robinson treehouse and the Tiki Bird show as you made your way toward Pirates of the Caribbean. And so it was this progressive transition from the outside world to the worlds of storytelling, which have been very effective. And when you stop and think about it, how many entertainment experiences can you think of that have had a longevity equal to rides like Small World, Pirates of the Caribbean, and Space Mountain? I mean, they're still entertaining people 2 generations after they were built. And it's pretty remarkable, the longevity of that idea. And of all the parks now that Disney has worldwide, and there's Animal Kingdom and then movie parks and Epcot and California Adventure, the most popular parks anywhere in the world are still the Magic Kingdom parks, the castle parks that are all spin-offs of Disneyland. So there's something really timeless and brilliant about that design that has given it a very long shelf life. Anyway, next time I will proceed ahead.
The best part of working at Disneyland was going home, as I said, because the people were gone, and we would walk down Main Street to get out to operations. And Main Street was all a glitter, and it was empty, and it was very nostalgic, and I really enjoyed that part.
You know, I will add too, I haven't mentioned creative entertainment, because one of the big things about Disneyland is meeting the characters, the walk around characters. And if you ask guests what their favorite experiences are, that always is high on the list. And of course, Disney didn't refer to the employees as employees, they were cast members. And when you were on stage, you were part of the show and treated as such. And I actually had the experience of being a walk around character for a short time, which I'll share with you next time. But the parades, the live performances are a big part of it. I'm sorry? I didn't hear that, so was it a question? Okay, well, all right. So I'm done with chapter 1, and I hope some of you will come back for chapter 2 next Tuesday, and I'll go on with my life as an Imagineer. Thank you for being here.
Any more
Thank you,
questions?
Barry.
Yeah, anything? Nope. Okay, see you next week.
Thanks,
Hopefully.
Barry.
You're welcome.